There is no denying that the history of slavery is widely acknowledged in the United States. But there are aspects of this dark chapter that have received insufficient attention within educational curricula and popular discourse. Slavery, as an institution, was built upon the premise of forced labor and the ownership of human beings. However, the extent to which owners controlled the lives of the enslaved is a topic that is frequently omitted or glossed over. Today, we will delve into lesser-known facts surrounding slave breeding, exploring the motivations behind this practice, its varied regional manifestations, the impacts on families, and the long-lasting repercussions that continue to resonate in African American communities in the current era. Slave owners regularly forced male slaves to sexually abuse and rape enslaved women. In the past, some slave owners exerted their power and control by compelling the most physically imposing male slaves to rape female slaves in order to basically breed stronger servants. This was not a mutually agreed upon interaction. Instead, it was a brutal violation of the enslaved individual's rights and dignity. These acts of sexual abuse and rape were part of the broader system of dehumanization inflicted upon the enslaved population as slave owners wielded their authority and manipulated the lives and bodies of those they considered their property. The practice was a cruel demonstration of power. Not only did the women endure physical and emotional trauma, but they also faced the enduring psychological scars that resulted from these unspeakable violations. Plus, the impacts extended beyond the immediate victims, with families completely torn apart and the children left with a grim fate. Many female slaves were forced into sexual slavery and were regularly raped by their masters and other white men. During the era of slavery, not only were female slaves treated like baby-making machines, many were also tragically reduced to objects of sexual exploitation by their owner. The sexual exploitation of female slaves occurred in various forms. Their masters would often force themselves upon these women, subjecting them to rape and sexual abuse. Moreover, other white men within the community also treated these women as objects of their desire. Olada Equiano, a former slave, bore witness to a multitude of horrors inflicted upon his fellow enslaved people. As he served under his master's employ, he found himself entrusted with the care of newly arrived African captives who were destined for sale. Regrettably, it became an all-too-common occurrence for the clerks and other white people associated with the trade to commit heinous acts of sexual violence against the female slaves. Equiano, with a heavy heart, was compelled to be only a witness, as he himself was powerless to intervene and offer assistance. The despicable conduct he observed aboard the vessels during slave transportations to other islands or to America tarnished not only the reputation of Christians, but also that of humanity itself. Shockingly, Equiano even recounted instances where these acts of depravity were committed against girls as young as 10 years old. Another formerly enslaved individual, Henry Bibb, hailing from Shelby County, Kentucky, further emphasized the dire predicament faced by enslaved women. Bibb argued that a slave woman's fidelity to her husband could never be assured when it clashed with the desires of her master. The oppressive system left her with no choice but to succumb to acts of adultery dictated by her owner's whim. She was denied the ability to maintain her purity and virtue against the will of her master. Death rates amongst enslaved people were very high. It was distressingly common for the mortality rate among enslaved individuals to be alarmingly high. In order to compensate for these losses, plantation owners adopted a troubling approach by encouraging enslaved women to bear more children. This practice often commenced when these women were merely 13 years old, with the expectation that by the age of 20, they would have given birth to at least 4 or 5 children. To incentivize childbearing, some owners even made promises to grant freedom to women slaves after they had successfully delivered 15 offspring. Young women were often advertised for sale as good breeding stocks. In an account by Charles Ball, a slave hailing from Maryland, he recounts a chilling incident at a slave market where pregnant slaves were sold. Ball describes a stranger, a weathered and sunburned figure who expressed a desire to acquire a couple of breeding wenches, offering to pay an amount equal to what they would fetch in Georgia. This individual proceeded to assess the entire lineup of chained slaves, specifically focusing on the women. He inquired about the prices of the 2 pregnant women, and their master proudly proclaimed that these were among the most valuable breeding women in all of Maryland. He stated that one of them was 22 years old and had already given birth to 7 children, while the other was 19 and had 4 children to her name. The master further emphasized that he had personally witnessed the children's birth and claimed that these wenches would be considered a bargain at $1,000 each. However, due to their inability to keep pace with the work gang, he was willing to part with them for $1,200 as a combined price. The reprehensible nature of these practices becomes evident when we consider the recollections of individuals like Harriet Jacobs. Her autobiography brings to light the emotional and physical torment endured by young enslaved women at the hands of their masters. Despite her attempts to resist, the power imbalance and fear of retribution left her vulnerable to her master's advances. Tragically, Harriet's experience was not an isolated incident, as numerous other enslaved women fell victim to similar exploitation. Masters would often beat pregnant women to intentionally cause miscarriage to preserve the woman's economic value. Similarly to how some masters encouraged slaves to bore more children, others were driven by the desire to maintain the productivity of their enslaved workforce and resorted to physically abusing pregnant women. These acts were intended to induce miscarriages, thereby preventing the birth of a child who would not immediately contribute to labor and who would require additional resources and care. Many historical accounts and narratives from former slaves describe the systemic abuse and violence they endured. For example, the narratives collected by the Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project during the 1930s, known as the slave narratives, provide valuable first-hand accounts of the lives of former slaves. While not all narratives directly mention beatings or miscarriages, they do shed light on the physical and emotional abuse endured by enslaved women. These narratives highlight the vulnerability and mistreatment that pregnant slaves faced, often being subject to strenuous labor, inadequate nutrition, and the separation of families. Children were frequently separated from their mothers at very young ages. Slave owners primarily derived their wealth from the people they owned, leading them to frequently buy and sell individuals based on financial circumstances. Numerous situations could trigger a sale. For instance, an enslaved person might be sold as part of an inheritance when their owner passed away, or if the owner needed to raise funds to settle debts. Troublemakers, as perceived by the owner, could also be sold. Heartbreakingly, a father could be sold away while the mother and children remained behind, or vice versa, tearing families apart. Inheritance disputes or the desire of the owner's adult children to establish new lives elsewhere often resulted in the division of enslaved families, with some members taken away. Unfortunately, those most affected by these decisions had no say in the matter. At times, an enslaved individual would desperately plead with their owner to purchase their spouse to avoid separation, but such appeals were not always successful. According to historian Michael Tadman, approximately 1/3 of enslaved children in Maryland and Virginia experienced family separation in the Upper South states. This separation could occur in 3 possible scenarios: tearing apart families by selling only the kids, children getting sold with their mother while their father remained, or the sale of a parent which left the child behind. The constant fear of separation weighed heavily on adults who were well aware of its likelihood, while young children quickly learned about the painful consequences of such separations. Whippings were a common occurrence, and many slaves died as a result. On plantations and in various other settings, a pervasive sense of fear hung in the air as overseers and owners unleashed their wrath upon the backs of enslaved individuals. The crack of the whip echoed through the fields, accompanied by agonizing cries and the sickening sound of flesh being struck. The purpose behind these whippings was twofold: to maintain a brutal system of control and to serve as a deterrent against any notion of rebellion or resistance. For the enslaved, each lash brought with it excruciating pain and suffering. The sting of the whip tore through their skin, leaving behind deep, lasting scars that served as physical reminders of their anguish, but the consequences went far beyond the immediate agony. The severe beatings often resulted in severe injuries, infections, and, tragically, death. The physical toll, however, was just one face of the anguish endured by those subjected to this cruel punishment. All children born in the country were held bond or free, according to the status of their mothers. The utilization of enslaved workers was not only sanctioned, but also encouraged by the implementation of a Virginia law in 1662. The law stated that the status of a child would follow that of the mother, effectively establishing a system where enslaved women gave birth to generations of children of African descent who were regarded as commodities. This natural increase in the enslaved population played a significant role in transforming the colonies, and later, the United States, into a slave nation. By enforcing this law, European colonists and their descendants secured their wealth, while simultaneously imposing legal restrictions on free black individuals, denying them the ability to pass down their wealth to their children. Simultaneously, racial and class divisions were systematically embedded within the legal framework. An example of this can be seen in the case of John Punch, a black servant, who attempted to escape bondage alongside two white indentured servants in the 1640. When captured, Punch was condemned to a lifetime of enslavement, while his white companions received extended periods of servitude. Following Bacon's Rebellion, which witnessed alliances between free and enslaved black individuals and impoverished white and yeoman farmers against the government, stricter laws were enacted to solidify distinctions based on race and class. Consequently, black individuals in America were subjected to lifelong enslavement, while the privileges associated with being white were officially institutionalized. In the antebellum slavery in the American South, on some plantations, the children of field slaves were fed on the floor or in troughs like animals. During the era of antebellum slavery in the American South, distressing practices prevailed on certain plantations. Particularly, it was not uncommon for the children of field slaves to be fed in a dehumanizing manner, akin to animals. The recollections of former slaves provide us with glimpses into this harsh reality. In one account from the 1930s Federal Writers Project Bupi Oral History interviews, ex-slave Mom Ryer, Emmanuel vividly described how they would string little wooden bowls in a row on the floor, and the children would crouch down to drink from them. Resembling pigs, the circumstances were such that they had to blow on the hot liquid before consuming it, as they lacked the luxury of waiting for it to cool down. Similarly, Philip Evans, who had experienced slavery on General John Bratton's South Carolina plantation, recounted that in the larger quarters where multiple families resided, a substantial number of children were present. They would be fed using long trays placed on planks, emphasizing the utilitarian approach to nourishing these young souls. Enslaved persons had a lower worth than the fleeting pleasure of sweets. Before cotton became the dominant crop in American agriculture, it was sugar that fueled the slave trade across the Caribbean and Spanish Americas. Sugarcane cultivation was an incredibly demanding and brutal endeavor, requiring relentless labor 6 days a week. The cultivation process itself inflicted severe injuries, burns, and even death upon those involved. Shockingly, the life expectancy of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation could be as short as 7 years. However, plantation owners remained undeterred, pushing their enslaved laborers to the point of exhaustion and death. They prepared for this high mortality rate by ensuring a constant influx of new enslaved individuals to replace those who perished. British poet William Cowper eloquently captured this callous mindset when he penned the words, "I pity them greatly, but I must be mum, for how could we do without sugar or rum?" The insatiable desire for sweetening agents like sugar and coffee and tea took precedence over human lives, setting a disturbing precedent for the institution of slavery in the Americas. These circumstances demonstrate the harsh realities of an era where economic gain and convenience overshadowed the value of human life, leaving an indelible mark on the history of slavery in the region. And that's the undiluted truth of slave breeding in the United States, a distressing and painful chapter in history that continues to resonate today. The history of slavery goes far beyond what is covered in textbooks. By delving deeper into this topic, reading reputable sources, and engaging in meaningful discussions, we can challenge the incomplete narratives we may have been taught and strive for a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the past. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel for more educational content. By hitting the subscribe button and turning on post notifications, you will stay updated on our latest videos and join a community of learners dedicated to exploring diverse historical perspectives.